22 years ago, a police officer made a decision that would haunt him forever, saving a young black boy during a deadly convenience store robbery, but failing to save the boy's mother. He handed the boy his badge number and walked away, thinking he'd never see him again. But today the doorbell rings and the same boy stands there, now a successful man. He's come back not just to repay the officer's kindness, but to transform his entire life. What secrets has this man been carrying all these years? And how will one act of heroism lead to a journey of redemption, forgiveness, and unexpected family? This is a story you won't forget. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The December wind whistled through the nearly empty streets, carrying the faint melody of Silent Night from a nearby storefront. Officer John Marshall's grip tightened on his steering wheel as he responded to the 911 call about an armed robbery at Pete's convenience store. The red and blue lights of his patrol car bounced off the frost-covered windows of parked cars, creating an eerie dance of colors in the winter darkness. As John pulled up to the store, his trained eyes quickly assessed the scene. Through the foggy windows, he could make out three figures, one behind the counter, another holding what appeared to be a weapon, and a third person lying on the ground. The sound that made his heart skip a beat wasn't the gunman shouting, but the muffled sobs of a child coming from inside. John's hand instinctively moved to his service weapon as he approached the store entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a gentle whoosh, letting out a burst of warm air mixed with the scent of coffee and fear. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the linoleum floor. "Please," a young voice cracked through the tension. "My mom needs help." John's eyes found the source. A small boy, no more than 11, kneeling beside a woman who lay still on the floor. Blood pooled beneath her, spreading across the white tiles like spilled paint. The boy's hands pressed desperately against his mother's wound, his small frame shaking with each sob. "Nobody move!" the robber screamed, swinging his gun between John and the terrified cashier. "I'll shoot! I swear I'll shoot!" John raised his hand slowly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Let's calm down here. Nobody else needs to get hurt tonight." The robber's eyes were wild, darting between his hostages like a cornered animal. His finger trembled against the trigger, and John knew they were seconds away from more bloodshed. "The boy needs to get his mother help," John said softly, taking a careful step forward. "Let him go, and we can work this out." "Stay back!" The robber's gun swung toward John, but his hands were shaking so badly the weapon wobbled in his grip. "Mom," the boy whimpered, "please wake up. Please." Everything happened in a blur of motion and sound. The robber turned toward the boy's voice, his gun following his gaze. John's training took over. 2 shots rang out, and the robber crumpled to the ground. John rushed to the woman's side, pulling off his jacket to apply pressure to her wound. "What's your name, son?" he asked the boy, trying to keep him focused. Isaiah," the child stammered. "Isaiah Thompson. Please help my mom." "Linda," the woman whispered, her eyes fluttering. "My name is Linda." John could hear sirens in the distance as he radioed for immediate medical assistance. "Stay with us, Linda," he urged, pressing harder on the wound. "Help is coming." Isaiah held his mother's hand, his small fingers intertwined with hers. "Mom, please don't go. Please don't leave me." Linda's eyes found her son's face, a weak smile crossing her lips. "My brave boy," she whispered, her voice growing fainter with each word. "My Isaiah." John watched helplessly as the light faded from Linda's eyes, her hand going limp in Isaiah's grip. The boy's anguished cry echoed through the store, drowning out even the approaching sirens. John pulled Isaiah close, shielding him from the sight of his mother's body, feeling the boy's tears soak through his uniform shirt. The convenience store's holiday music played on, an inappropriately cheerful backdrop to the tragedy that had just unfolded. Outside, the winter wind continued to blow, indifferent to the lives forever changed within those 4 walls. The headlights of John's patrol car swept across the front of his modest suburban home as he pulled into the driveway. The clock on his dashboard read 10:47 p.m. His shoulders felt heavy, weighed down by the events at the convenience store. The image of Isaiah's tear-streaked face in Linda's final moments kept replaying in his mind. The house was mostly dark, except for the flickering blue glow of the television spilling from the living room windows. John's footsteps seemed too loud on the concrete path leading to the front door. His key scraped against the lock and he stepped into the quiet house. Sarah sat rigid on the couch, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. The television murmured in the background, but John could tell she wasn't watching it. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Sarah," he started, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I know I'm late." "Late?" Sarah's voice was quiet but sharp. "You missed it completely, John. You weren't late. You weren't there at all." John's hand went to his face, rubbing his tired eyes. "There was an emergency call." "There's always an emergency call." Sarah's voice rose slightly. Then she caught herself, glancing toward the hallway where Emily's room was. "She practiced for weeks, John. Weeks. She wanted you to see her play that piece so badly." The weight in John's chest grew heavier. "I tried to make it. There was a robbery. A woman was shot." "And what about your daughter?" Sarah stood up, her hands clenched at her sides. "Do you have any idea what it was like watching her scan the audience again and again, looking for you? She kept missing notes because she couldn't stop looking at the empty seat where you were supposed to be." A small creak from the hallway caught their attention. Through the dim light, they could see Emily's small figure in her pajamas, peeking around the corner. Her long hair was messy from sleep, her eyes wide and uncertain. Before either parent could say anything, she disappeared back into the darkness of the hallway, the soft click of her bedroom door following moments later. "I'm trying my best," John said, his voice cracking slightly. "Today I had to watch a boy lose his mother. He was Emily's age, Sarah. What was I supposed to do?" "You're watching your own child lose her father," Sarah replied, tears gathering in her eyes. "Not to death, but to absence. To choosing everything else over her, over us, every single time." The words hit John like physical blows. He sank into the armchair, his badge digging into his hip. "That's not fair." "No, what's not fair is being married to a ghost," Sarah cut him off. "What's not fair is raising our daughter practically alone while you're out saving everyone else's family except your own." She took a shaky breath. I think we need to separate, John." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. John felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. Sarah turned away, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Without another word, she walked toward their bedroom, leaving John alone in the dim living room. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands, the same hands that had tried to save Linda Thompson hours earlier, but couldn't save his own family now. The quiet of the house pressed in around him, broken only by the soft ticking of the kitchen clock marking each moment of his world falling apart. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed overhead as John Marshall pushed through the heavy glass doors. The clock on the wall read 6:45 a.m., earlier than usual. But sleep had been impossible after last night's fight with Sarah. His wedding ring felt heavy on his finger, a constant reminder of what he stood to lose. The morning shift was just getting started. Officers milled around with steaming coffee cups, their voices echoing off the worn linoleum floors. The familiar smell of coffee and paper filled the air. But today, it brought no comfort. "Morning, Marshal," called Officer Rodriguez from the break room. John managed a weak nod as he made his way to the coffee machine. His hands shook slightly as he poured the dark liquid into a styrofoam cup. At his desk, the incident report from last night's robbery sat waiting. The manila folder looked innocent enough, but John knew the weight of what lay inside. The clinical details of Linda Thompson's death, her son Isaiah's tears, the sound of gunfire in that small convenience store. "Hey partner, heard about that mess last night?" Officer Mike Callahan's voice cut through John's thoughts. Mike leaned against John's desk, munching on a donut. "Just another domestic gone bad, huh? At least you got the perp." John's jaw tightened, his fingers curled around his coffee cup. "A woman died, Mike. Her son watched it happen." Yeah, I know." Mike brushed powdered sugar from his uniform. But that's the job, right? Can't save everyone. The casual dismissal made John's stomach turn. He turned to his computer, hoping Mike would take the hint. Instead, his partner continued chattering about weekend plans and sports scores, each word grating on John's nerves. After Mike finally wandered off, John found himself staring at Isaiah's information in the report. The boy's face haunted him, those terrified eyes, the way his small hands had clutched his mother's lifeless body. Before he could stop himself, John was walking toward Captain Roberts' office. The captain looked up from her paperwork as he entered. "Marshal? What is it?" "Ma'am, about the Thompson case from last night." John shifted his weight. "I'd like to follow up on the boy's placement. Make sure he's okay." Captain Roberts sighed, removing her reading glasses. "John, we've got 3 active cases needing attention. Social Services has it handled. Focus on what's in front of you." "But..." "That's all, Officer Marshall." Back at his desk, John opened the incident report again. Each typed line felt like an accusation. Time of arrival, 8:47 p.m. Subject deceased, Linda Thompson, age 35. He'd followed procedure, done everything by the book. So why did it feel like such a massive failure? The precinct bustled around him, phones ringing, officers talking, the constant hum of activity. But John felt completely alone with his thoughts, trapped in that convenience store moment when everything went wrong. As evening approached, John gathered his things. The setting sun cast long shadows through the precinct windows. He walked to his car in silence, his footsteps echoing in the parking garage. The badge number he'd given Isaiah felt like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The Social Services building stood stark against the gray winter sky, its brick facade weathered by decades of Chicago winters. John Marshall pulled into the visitors' parking lot, his police cruiser's tires crunching over patches of leftover snow. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he gathered his courage to go inside. The interior was eerily quiet, with only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of phones ringing. The walls were decorated with children's artwork, their bright colors a stark contrast to the institutional beige paint beneath. A sign pointed him toward the Family Services wing. Ms. Angela Collins met him at the reception desk, her kind face creased with concern. "Officer Marshall, thank you for coming," she said softly. "Isaiah's been asking for you." They walked down a narrow hallway to a small meeting room. Through the window in the door, John could see Isaiah sitting alone, his small frame hunched over in an oversized chair. In his hands, he clutched John's badge number like a lifeline. "He hasn't let go of that number since that night," Angela explained. "It seems to give him comfort." John's throat tightened as he entered the room. Isaiah looked up, his dark eyes red-rimmed from crying. He wore clean clothes that seemed slightly too big for him. Donations, probably. The sight made John's heart ache. Kneeling down to Isaiah's level, John forced a gentle smile. "Hey, buddy. How are you holding up?" Isaiah's lower lip trembled. "Okay, I guess," he whispered, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper with John's badge number. "They say I have to go live with new people." Angela stepped forward, her voice gentle but professional. "We've found a wonderful foster family for Isaiah. The Hendersons have experience with children who've been through trauma. They live in a nice neighborhood with good schools." John nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "That sounds good, Isaiah. A fresh start can be scary, but sometimes it's exactly what we need." "Do you," Isaiah's voice cracked, "do you think my mom can see me? From heaven? Do you think she knows I'm okay?" The question hit John like a physical blow. He swallowed hard, remembering Sarah's words about his emotional distance. But here, now, he couldn't afford to be distant. This boy needed more than that. "I believe she does," John said softly, placing a gentle hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "And I know she'd want you to be strong, but being strong doesn't mean you can't be sad or scared sometimes. It just means you keep going, even when things are tough." Suddenly, Isaiah launched forward, wrapping his arms around John's neck in a tight hug. "Thank you," he whispered. then started to hand back the badge number. John gently pushed it back toward Isaiah's chest. "Keep it," he insisted. "You might need it someday. Whenever you're feeling alone or scared, you can look at it and remember that there are people who care about you." Through the window, John could see a couple waiting. The Hendersons, he assumed. They looked kind, but he could see the anxiety on Isaiah's face as Angela began gathering his few belongings. As Isaiah was led toward the door, he looked back at John one final time, tears streaming down his face. John stood rooted to the spot, watching as the boy disappeared down the hallway. The ache in his chest felt unbearable, a physical manifestation of all the things he couldn't fix, couldn't save, couldn't protect. The winter sunlight filtered weakly through the living room windows of the Marshall home, casting long shadows across cardboard boxes scattered throughout the room. The house that had once echoed with family dinners and weekend movie nights now felt hollow, filled only with the sharp sound of packing tape being pulled and torn. John sat motionless on the leather couch, his police badge heavy in his pocket. His eyes were fixed on a spot on the carpet where Emily had spilled grape juice last summer. They'd laughed about it then. Now the stain seemed to mock him. Sarah moved efficiently through the room, wrapping photo frames in newspaper and placing them carefully in boxes. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, but her hands trembled slightly when she came across their wedding photo. She paused for a moment before wrapping it too. Emily stood in the doorway, clutching her worn stuffed elephant named Trunk. She wore her favorite purple backpack, already packed with her most important possessions. Her eyes darted between her parents, trying to make sense of the situation that was tearing her world apart. "I've given you so many chances, John," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion as she taped another box shut. "Years of chances. I can't keep waiting for you to choose us." John's throat felt tight. "Sarah, please, we can work this out. I'll cut back my hours, You've said that before," Sarah interrupted, straightening up. "After Emily's birthday party that you missed, after the Christmas concert last year, after every time you've disappointed us." Her voice cracked slightly. "I can't keep living on promises." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Emily squeezed Trunk tighter, her small fingers white from the pressure. "Daddy?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why can't you come with us? Don't you want to?" John's heart shattered at the question. He looked at his daughter, her brown eyes wide and pleading, and found himself fumbling for words. I have to stay here, sweetheart. For work. The city needs me." Emily's face fell, and John knew instantly he'd given the wrong answer. Again. "The city needs you," Sarah repeated quietly, shaking her head. "That's always been the problem, hasn't it? The city, the job, the next case, they've always needed you more than we do." John watched helplessly as Sarah closed the final box. The living room looked bare now, with empty spaces on the walls where family photos had hung. The bookshelf was half empty, Emily's favorite bedtime stories already packed away. Sarah picked up 2 boxes, balancing them carefully. "Emily, honey, can you grab your suitcase? It's by the stairs." Emily looked at her father one last time, hope still flickering in her eyes, waiting for him to say something. Anything that would fix this. But John remained silent, trapped in a prison of his own making, watching as his daughter's hope died a little more. The sound of boxes being loaded into the car seemed to echo through the house. Each thud felt like another nail in the coffin of his marriage, of his family, of everything he'd taken for granted for so long. The precinct hummed with the usual background noise, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, and the distant murmur of conversations. John sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of incident reports and half-empty coffee cups. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the dusty blinds, casting striped shadows across his workspace. His eyes landed on an envelope mixed in with his daily mail. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, clearly from a young person trying their best to write neatly. The return address made his heart skip a beat. It was from Isaiah's foster home. John's hands felt unusually heavy as he picked up the envelope. He took a deep breath before carefully opening it, pulling out 2 pages of lined notebook paper covered in blue ink. "Dear Officer Marshall," the letter began. John noticed some words had been erased and rewritten, as if Isaiah had wanted to get everything just right. "I hope you remember me. My new foster family is nice. They have a dog named Max who sleeps next to my bed sometimes when I have bad dreams. Mrs. Peterson makes really good pancakes on Sundays, but they're not as good as my mom's were." John's throat tightened. He glanced around the office, grateful that no one was paying attention to him. "I keep your badge number under my pillow. Sometimes when I'm scared at night, I hold it tight and remember how you helped me. It makes me feel safer, like maybe someone is still watching out for me." The paper crinkled slightly in John's trembling hands as he continued reading. "I got an A on my math test last week. Mom always said I was good at numbers. I think she would be proud. Do you think she can see me from heaven? Mrs. Peterson says she can, but I wanted to ask you too." John had to pause, removing his reading glasses to wipe them with his shirt. The words blurred together for a moment before he could continue. "Thank you for being nice to me that night. I know you tried to save my mom. I remember how you kept talking to her, telling her to hold on. I'm sorry she couldn't." The innocence and forgiveness in those words hit John like a physical blow. He remembered Linda Thompson's final moments with painful clarity, her hand growing limp in his as he desperately tried to keep pressure on her wound. "My counselor says it's good to write letters to people who are important to us. You're important because you were there on the worst night of my life, but you made me feel less alone." John placed the letter on his desk, running his hands over his face. The urge to respond was strong, but what could he possibly say? How could he put into words the complexity of his feelings, the guilt, the regret, the pride in seeing Isaiah's resilience? He opened his desk drawer and carefully placed the letter inside, next to his spare badge and family photos he couldn't bear to look at anymore. The drawer closed with a soft thud, and John turned to stare out the window, watching clouds drift across the afternoon sky. In the quiet of his office, the weight of all the things he couldn't say pressed down on him like a physical presence. The letter sat in his drawer, waiting for a response he didn't know how to give. The years slipped away like pages torn from a calendar, each season bringing subtle changes to John Marshall's life. His dark hair gradually gave way to streaks of silver, then white, while wrinkles etched themselves deeper around his eyes. The once pristine lawn of his house grew patchy and unkempt, mirroring the neglect that had crept into his personal life. Every few months, a letter would arrive from the Petersons, Isaiah's foster family. They wrote detailed updates about Isaiah's progress, honor roll certificates, debate team victories, and college preparation classes. John would read each letter multiple times, carefully storing them in a worn manila folder he kept in his desk drawer. "Isaiah's working hard for that scholarship," one letter read, "but he still has nightmares sometimes. He keeps your badge number close, says it helps him feel safe." The updates about Isaiah stood in stark contrast to his relationship with Emily. Their phone calls grew shorter and less frequent, filled with long pauses and surface-level conversations about weather and work. When Emily did visit, usually around holidays, she'd sit stiffly on the edge of the couch, checking her phone frequently, as if hoping for an excuse to leave early. "How's work, Dad?" she'd ask, not quite meeting his eyes. "Fine," he'd reply, unable to bridge the gulf between them. "Busy as always." The house grew quieter with each passing year. Dust gathered on family photos that hadn't been updated since Emily was in middle school. The kitchen table where they once shared family meals became a storage space for unopened mail and old newspapers. When retirement finally came, there was no celebration. No colleagues gathered for cake and speeches. John had kept to himself too long for that. He packed up his desk quietly one Friday afternoon, sliding his badge and service weapon across the captain's desk without ceremony. The move to the apartment was quick and simple. John had few possessions he truly cared about: some clothes, basic furniture, and a small box of precious items. Inside were Emily's school photos, showing her growth from a gap-toothed first grader to a serious-faced teenager. At the bottom lay Isaiah's first letter, the paper soft and creased from repeated readings. His new apartment was modest, a one-bedroom unit in a quiet complex across town. The walls remained bare except for his service commendations, which he hung more out of habit than pride. The kitchen held only enough dishes for one person, and the living room furniture faced a TV that rarely got turned on. On a quiet evening, John sat in his worn armchair, the box of memories open on his lap. The dim light from a single lamp cast long shadows across the room as he carefully unfolded Isaiah's letter, reading words he'd memorized years ago. His fingers traced the careful handwriting of a boy who'd lost everything, but somehow found the strength to keep going. The letter offered a small comfort in the silence of his apartment, a reminder that even in his darkest moment as a cop, he'd managed to make a difference in someone's life, even if he'd failed to do the same for his own family. The autumn morning painted John's small apartment in shades of amber and gold. He sat at his kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug that had seen better days. Through the window, maple leaves danced in the October breeze, their colors a vibrant display of red and orange against the pale sky. John's morning routine hadn't changed in years. Coffee at 7, followed by the crossword puzzle he never quite finished. The silence in his apartment felt heavy, broken only by the gentle ticking of the wall clock and the occasional sip of coffee. His shoulders slumped as he remembered Emily's latest missed call. He'd tried reaching out last week, but only got her voicemail. Again. The distance between them seemed to grow wider with each passing year. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. It was unusual for anyone to visit, especially this early. His neighbors kept to themselves, and he hadn't ordered any packages. John's joints creaked as he pushed himself up from the kitchen chair. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Coming," John called out, his voice rough from disuse. He shuffled to the door, checking through the peephole out of old habit. On his doorstep stood a tall man in a crisp charcoal suit. His dark skin contrasted sharply with his white dress shirt, and his warm brown eyes held a hint of nervousness despite his professional demeanor. Something about those eyes tugged at John's memory. John opened the door cautiously. The man's face broke into a wide smile that transformed his entire appearance. "You probably don't remember me," he said, his voice carrying a trace of emotion. "But you saved my life 22 years ago." John's hand gripped the doorframe as recognition hit him like a physical force. "Isaiah," he whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Isaiah Thompson nodded, his smile growing wider. "It's me, Officer Marshall. Though I guess it's just Mr. Marshall now?" John stood frozen, taking in the man before him. Gone was the terrified 11-year-old boy, replaced by someone who carried himself with quiet confidence. Yet there was something in his expression that reminded John of that night so long ago, a depth of feeling that time hadn't erased. "I've been wanting to thank you properly," Isaiah continued, reaching into his suit pocket and pulling out a familiar object. "I kept this all these years." He held up the badge number, the metal worn smooth from years of handling. John's vision blurred slightly. "You became a lawyer?" he managed to ask, noticing Isaiah's attire and bearing. "I did, and I'd love to tell you all about it. Would you join me for dinner tonight? There's something important I'd like to discuss with you." John hesitated, his instinct to withdraw warring with an unexpected surge of curiosity. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "I'd like that." "Wonderful!" Isaiah's face lit up. "I'll pick you up at 7? He scribbled his phone number on a business card and handed it to John. As Isaiah turned to leave, John watched him walk down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the worn carpet. The business card felt heavy in John's hand, like a weight of possibility he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. 2-story suburban home. Golden light spilled from the windows, and the sound of cheerful voices drifted through the evening air. His worn leather jacket and faded jeans felt suddenly inadequate against the backdrop of such obvious success. Before he could second-guess himself, the door swung open. Isaiah stood there, his smile warm and genuine, dressed in casual but clearly expensive clothes. "John, I'm so glad you made it," he beamed, stepping aside to welcome him in. The entryway opened into a spacious living room with high ceilings and family photos covering the walls. A delicious aroma wafted from the kitchen, making John's stomach rumble despite his nervousness. "I'd like you to meet my family," Isaiah said, guiding John forward. A beautiful woman with kind eyes approached them, wiping her hands on an apron. "This is my wife, Camille." "It's wonderful to finally meet you," Camille said, her voice soft and sincere. "Isaiah has told me so much about you over the years." Before John could respond, small footsteps thundered down the stairs. A little girl with her father's eyes and her mother's smile bounded into the room. "Is this him? Is this the police officer?" she asked excitedly. Isaiah chuckled. "Yes, Lily. This is Mr. Marshall, the man I told you about." Lily's eyes went wide with wonder. "You're a real-life hero," she declared, making John shift uncomfortably on his feet. "I'm no hero," he mumbled. But Lily was already tugging him toward the dining room, chattering about how her dad had told her stories about brave police officers. The dining room table was set beautifully, with cloth napkins and gleaming silverware. Steam rose from serving dishes filled with pot roast, roasted vegetables, and fresh rolls. John couldn't remember the last time he'd sat down to a proper family dinner. As they ate, Camille kept the conversation flowing naturally, asking John about his retirement and sharing stories about their family life. The warmth in the room was palpable, making John's throat tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. During a lull in the conversation, Isaiah set down his fork and looked at John seriously. "You know, the years after my mom died weren't easy," he said quietly. "The foster system was rough sometimes, but I always had your badge number in my pocket. It reminded me that there were good people in the world, people who cared enough to help strangers." John stared down at his plate, his chest tight. He didn't feel deserving of such praise. He'd failed to save Isaiah's mother. He'd failed his own family. But here was Isaiah, successful and happy, crediting him for giving him hope. "Dad says you gave him strength when he needed it most," Lily piped up, her innocent words making John's eyes burn. "Isaiah has done all this himself," John managed to say. "I just did my job that night." "You did so much more than that," Camille said softly, reaching across to squeeze her husband's hand. As the evening wound down, Isaiah insisted John stay longer, mentioning something important to discuss in the morning. Despite his instinct to retreat to his solitary apartment, John found himself nodding in agreement. The genuine warmth of this family had begun to thaw something frozen inside him, though he wasn't quite ready to examine what that meant. The living room settled into a comfortable quiet as Camille and Lily headed upstairs for bed. Only the soft pop and crackle of burning wood in the fireplace filled the space between John and Isaiah. The leather armchairs creaked as they adjusted their positions, coffee cups warming their hands in the evening chill. Isaiah broke the silence first, his voice softer than it had been during dinner. "You know, I kept that badge number with me everywhere." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn piece of paper, carefully unfolding it. "Even after all these years." John's throat tightened as he recognized his handwriting, faded but still legible on the yellowed paper. "Foster care wasn't easy," Isaiah continued, running his thumb over the numbers. "The first family was nice enough, but they had 4 other kids. I felt lost in the shuffle. The second family..." He paused, taking a slow breath. "Let's just say they were in it for the wrong reasons." John's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "I'm sorry. I should have checked on you more." Isaiah shook his head. "That's not why I'm telling you this. See, whenever things got really tough, I'd pull out this number. It reminded me that someone cared enough to try to save both me and my mom that night. Someone who didn't even know us." The firelight cast dancing shadows across Isaiah's face as he spoke. "I used to imagine what my mom would think of me now. When I was struggling with homework or feeling alone, I'd picture her telling me to keep going. And somehow your badge number became part of that. Like a lucky charm, I guess." John shifted uncomfortably. "I'm no hero, Isaiah. I was just doing my job." "See, that's where you're wrong," Isaiah said firmly. "You didn't just do your job. You showed kindness. You gave a scared kid hope when his whole world fell apart. That matters." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I worked my way through college, then law school. Every time I wanted to quit, I'd think about my mom, and I'd touch that paper with your badge number. It reminded me that good people exist, that one person can make a difference. John's voice was rough when he spoke. I've always wondered if I could have done more that night. If I'd been faster, maybe— Don't, Isaiah interrupted gently. You did everything you could. What happened to my mom wasn't your fault. What matters is what you did for me afterward. That small act of kindness, it changed everything. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the flames dance. Isaiah's words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. When Isaiah finally stood to head to bed, he squeezed John's shoulder as he passed. Left alone, John stared into the dying fire. The praise felt foreign, uncomfortable. His mind wandered to his own daughter, to all the times he'd failed to be there. He wondered if he deserved any of this gratitude when he couldn't even keep his own family together. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as the aroma of fresh coffee and pancakes filled the air. Lily, her dark curls bouncing with excitement, sat at the breakfast table next to John, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Did you have a police car with flashing lights?" she asked, syrup dripping from her fork. John couldn't help but smile. "I sure did. Blue and red lights on top." "And a siren?" Lily leaned forward, nearly putting her elbow in her pancakes. "Careful, sweetheart," Camille reminded gently, sliding a napkin closer to her daughter. "Yes, a very loud siren," John chuckled, surprising himself with how natural it felt to talk with the young girl. Camille moved around the kitchen with Grace, refilling coffee cups and tidying up. "Lily, honey, finish your breakfast. You'll be late for soccer practice." After breakfast, Isaiah suggested a walk through the neighborhood. The morning air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet as they strolled down the tree-lined street. "John," Isaiah began, his tone becoming more serious, "I've been thinking about something. About family." John's steps slowed slightly. "Oh?" "You know, working in family law, I see a lot of broken relationships," Isaiah continued. "But I've also seen incredible reconciliations. I'd like to help you reconnect with Sarah and Emily." John stopped walking, his hands instinctively going into his pockets. "Isaiah, I appreciate the thought, but it's been too long. Too much has happened, or rather, not happened." "That's exactly why now is the time," Isaiah pressed gently. "Let me tell you something. A few years ago, I tracked down my foster siblings. We'd lost touch after being separated, and I was terrified they'd want nothing to do with me." "What happened?" John asked quietly. "It wasn't easy at first," Isaiah admitted. "There were tears, anger, old hurts coming up. But we worked through it. Now we have monthly dinners together. My kids play with their kids." He paused, turning to face John. "Redemption isn't about erasing the past, John. It's about being brave enough to show up for the future." John shook his head, his voice rough. "They won't want to see me. Emily, she was just a kid when I let her down. And Sarah, I put the job before everything." "Maybe they will be angry," Isaiah acknowledged. "Maybe they'll need time. But don't they deserve the chance to make that choice for themselves?" They walked in silence for a moment, the morning sun warming their shoulders. "I wouldn't even know where to start," John finally said. "That's where I come in," Isaiah replied with a gentle smile. "You don't have to fix everything in one day. Just show up." John looked at the man beside him, no longer the frightened boy from that terrible night, but someone who had built a life full of love and purpose. Slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, I'll try." The morning sun filtered through the cafe's large windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden tables. John sat in a corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. He'd arrived 30 minutes early, his stomach in knots. The usual morning crowd bustled around him, students typing on laptops, business people checking their phones, but John barely noticed them. He watched the door like a sentry, his heart jumping each time it opened. The bell above the entrance chimed, and there she was. Sarah looked different, yet somehow exactly the same. Her hair had more gray now, styled shorter than he remembered. but her eyes still held that sharp intelligence that had first drawn him to her decades ago. She spotted him and walked over, her movements careful and measured. "John," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Sarah." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Thank you for coming." "Isaiah can be very persuasive," she replied, ordering a tea when the waitress approached. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. "You look well," John ventured. "Let's not do this," Sarah cut in, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "The small talk, the pleasantries, we're past that." John nodded, swallowing hard. "You're right. Do you know what Emily asked me on her 16th birthday?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "She asked if you even remembered when her birthday was, because you hadn't called. Again." The words hit John like physical blows. "I should have been there." "You should have been there for a lot of things, John. Her first dance recital, her high school graduation, when she broke her arm falling off her bike." Sarah's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables. "But you were always too busy saving everyone else's family to take care of your own." "I thought I was doing the right thing," John said quietly. "I thought if I could just help one more person, save one more life." He trailed off, realizing how hollow it sounded. "While your own daughter grew up wondering why she wasn't enough for you to come home to." Sarah's eyes glistened. "Do you know how many times I had to explain to her why Daddy missed another parent-teacher conference? Another Christmas morning?" John stared at his coffee cup, shame burning in his chest. "I was wrong, Sarah. I see that now. I let my job become an excuse to avoid the harder work of being present for my family. It's a little late for these revelations, don't you think?" Sarah's tone was bitter. "Maybe," John admitted, "but I'm trying to make it right, if you'll let me." Sarah gathered her purse, standing abruptly. "I'll think about letting you see Emily, but she's not that little girl anymore, John. She's grown up without you, and that's something you can't fix with a few apologies." John watched helplessly as Sarah walked away, her tea untouched on the table. Through the window, he saw her pause at her car, wiping her eyes quickly before getting in. He remained in the booth long after she'd driven away, the weight of his failures pressing down on him like a physical thing. The evening settled over Isaiah's home like a warm blanket, bringing with it a contemplative silence. In the living room, the soft glow of a table lamp cast gentle shadows across John's tired face as he sank deeper into the comfortable armchair. Above, the muffled sounds of Lily getting ready for bed, and Camille's gentle voice reading a bedtime story filtered down through the ceiling. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," Isaiah observed, settling into the couch across from John. He held 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea, offering one to John. John accepted the mug with a weak smile. Sarah, she had every right to say what she did. But hearing it all laid out like that, he shook his head, staring into his tea. "Tell me what you're thinking," Isaiah encouraged, his voice gentle but firm. John's shoulders slumped. "I keep wondering if there's any way back from this. 20 years of mistakes. How do you even begin to fix that?" His voice cracked slightly. "Emily grew up thinking she wasn't important enough for me to come home to?" Isaiah sat quietly for a moment, then set his mug down. "You know, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about my mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I look at this beautiful life I've built, this amazing family I have, and I feel guilty, like I don't deserve any of it." John looked up, surprised by the admission. "I remember that night so clearly," Isaiah continued, his eyes distant. "The sound of the gunshot, the way she looked at me before." He swallowed hard. "Sometimes I wonder if I've done enough with the life she died protecting, if being a lawyer, having a family, if it's enough to honor her memory." "Isaiah, you've done more than enough," John interjected. "Look at all the people you've helped, the life you've built." "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about," Isaiah cut him off, leaning forward. "You're trying to fix my problems instead of facing your own, just like you did back then, focusing on saving others instead of saving your own family." The words hung heavy in the air between them. John felt their weight, recognizing the truth in them. My guilt, my issues, they're mine to work through. Isaiah said more gently, just like your relationship with Sarah and Emily is yours to repair. We can't fix each other's burdens, John. We can only support each other while we face them. John nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his tired eyes. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer before Isaiah stood, squeezing John's shoulder as he passed. Get some rest, Isaiah said softly, heading toward the stairs. Tomorrow's another day. Left alone in the dim living room, John sat motionless, the weight of both their confessions settling around him like a heavy cloak. The house creaked quietly around him, a gentle reminder that some burdens were meant to be carried alone, even when surrounded by support. The morning sun streamed through Isaiah's kitchen windows, casting warm patches of light across the wooden table where John sat. His weathered hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug as he absently flipped through the morning paper, not really taking in any of the words. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and toast, creating a deceptively peaceful atmosphere that contrasted with John's internal turmoil. Isaiah entered the kitchen with measured steps, his suit already on for the workday ahead. In his hand, he held a cream-colored envelope. John, he said softly, I have something for you. John looked up, his eyes immediately fixing on the envelope. His heart seemed to skip a beat when he recognized the neat, precise handwriting, so similar to how Emily used to write her school assignments. I reached out to Emily, Isaiah explained, placing the envelope on the table. I thought it might help break the ice. John's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope. He stared at it for a long moment, running his thumb across his daughter's handwriting. I don't know if I can read this, he admitted quietly. Take your time, Isaiah said, sitting down across from him. But remember, she wrote back, that means something. With a deep breath, John carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. As he began to read, his face showed every emotion that passed through him. Dear Dad, the letter began, I've thought long and hard about whether to write this. John's eyes moved across the pages, taking in Emily's words about birthday parties he'd missed, school plays where she'd searched the audience in vain for his face, and graduation day when she'd held back tears during her valedictorian speech because his seat was empty. The pain in her words was raw and unfiltered. She wrote about lying awake at night, wondering if he even thought about her. She described the hurt of watching other fathers with their daughters, feeling the ache of what she'd missed. John's hands shook harder as he read, and Isaiah quietly placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. But near the end of the letter, Emily's tone shifted slightly. Maybe it's foolish, she wrote, but part of me still wants to understand why. If you're willing to really talk, not just make excuses but really talk, I might be open to meeting. But there would have to be ground rules, and I need time to think about what those would be. John carefully folded the letter, his movements deliberate and gentle, as if handling something incredibly fragile. He slipped it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, and looked up at Isaiah with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. I didn't think she'd even bother writing back, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. The autumn wind rustled through the nearly bare branches as John's car pulled up to Sarah's house. Dead leaves skittered across the sidewalk, and the gray sky matched his nervous mood. The modest two-story home looked exactly as he remembered it, though the blue paint had faded slightly and new curtains hung in the windows. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, gathering his courage. After several deep breaths, John stepped out of his car. The cold air bit at his face as he walked up the familiar concrete path, noting the cracks that hadn't been there years ago. Sarah's flower beds, once meticulously maintained, lay dormant for winter. His footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the wooden porch steps. John raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. The weight of all his past mistakes pressed down on his shoulders. Finally, he rapped gently on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah opened the door wearing a cream-colored sweater. Her hair had more gray than he remembered, but her eyes were still sharp and clear. "John," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," he replied softly. I needed to say something important. He paused, gathering his thoughts. May I come in? Sarah studied him for a moment before stepping aside. The living room was warm and inviting, though most of the family photos he remembered were gone. They sat across from each other, an uncomfortable silence stretching between them. Sarah, John began, his voice thick with emotion. I was wrong. About everything. The way I put my job before you and Emily. The way I convinced myself I was doing the right thing by helping strangers while neglecting my own family. He looked down at his hands. I was so focused on being a good cop that I forgot how to be a good husband and father. Sarah's expression softened slightly as she listened. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but held years of pain. Do you know how many nights Emily cried herself to sleep because you missed another school event? How many times I had to explain to her why Daddy couldn't make it to her birthday party? John felt each word like a physical blow. I can't change the past, he admitted, but I want to try to make things right if you'll let me. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. It wasn't just the missed events, John. It was the emotional absence. Even when you were home, you weren't really there. She turned to face him. I had to be both mother and father to Emily. Do you understand how exhausting that was? I do now, John said quietly. I understand so much more now than I did then. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Emily's hurt runs deep, she finally said. If you want to reconnect with her, you'll need to prove you're really committed this time. No more disappearing acts. I understand, John nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll think about talking to her, Sarah conceded. But John, don't make promises you can't keep. Not again. As John walked back to his car, Sarah watched from the doorway. The autumn wind continued to blow, carrying with it the possibility of change, however uncertain. He could feel her eyes on him as he drove away, hoping this small step forward might lead to something more. John arrived at the downtown Coffee Bean 30 minutes early, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. The familiar scent of freshly ground beans and pastries filled the air, but his stomach was too knotted to enjoy anything. Every time the bell above the door chimed, his head snapped up, heart racing. He'd chosen a quiet corner table, partially hidden behind a decorative plant. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm patches across the worn wooden tabletop. His fingers traced absent patterns on the cup's surface as he rehearsed what he wanted to say for the 100th time. At exactly 10 a.m., the bell chimed again. This time, Emily walked through the door. John's breath caught in his throat. His daughter had grown into a beautiful young woman, with her mother's graceful features and his own determined chin. She paused at the entrance, scanning the room with hesitant eyes until she spotted him. Emily approached slowly, her shoulders tense. Hi, Dad, she said quietly, sliding into the seat across from him. The word Dad sounded foreign, almost forced. Emily, John managed, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you for coming. An uncomfortable silence settled between them as Emily ordered a vanilla latte. John noticed how she fiddled with her pendant necklace, the same nervous habit she'd had as a child. I used to wear this to all my recitals, Emily said, suddenly touching the necklace. I kept hoping you'd show up and notice it. Her voice carried years of disappointment. John's chest tightened. I'm so sorry, Emily. I know those words aren't enough, but... You're right, she cut in, her eyes glistening. They're not enough. Do you know how many times I sat in the front row, scanning the audience for you? How many times Mom had to make excuses for why you weren't there? John listened, forcing himself to meet her hurt gaze. Each word struck like a physical blow, but he knew he deserved everyone. I watched other kids' dads show up for everything. Soccer games, school plays, parent-teacher conferences. But mine was always too busy saving everyone else to save time for his own daughter. I was wrong, John said softly. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing by helping others. But I failed the people who needed me most. You and your mother deserved better. Emily's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. We did, she agreed. But, she hesitated. Isaiah told me about what you did for him, how you stayed with him when his mom died. That doesn't excuse. No, it doesn't, Emily interrupted. But it helps me understand you better. She took a deep breath. I'm willing to try, Dad, to work on this, but it has to be different this time. I can't handle being disappointed again. Relief and gratitude washed over John. Whatever you need, whatever pace you want to set, I'm here. Emily nodded slowly. Baby steps, she said. Maybe we could meet for coffee again next week. I'd like that, John replied softly. When Emily stood to leave, she gave him a small, tentative smile, the first real smile he'd seen from her in years. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. John watched her walk away, hope blooming in his chest for the first time in decades. The autumn breeze rustled through the remaining leaves as John settled onto the wooden park bench, carefully holding 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate from the nearby cafe. The park was quiet except for the occasional jogger and the distant laughter of children on the playground. He'd arrived early, as usual, his nerves making him restless. Emily appeared right on time, wearing a burgundy sweater and carrying a small messenger bag. Her steps were measured but not hesitant as she approached. John noticed she'd cut her hair shorter since their coffee shop meeting, reminding him of how she'd worn it in high school, another milestone he'd missed. I got you hot chocolate, John said, offering her a cup. Extra whipped cream like you used to like it. Emily's eyes softened slightly as she accepted the drink. You remembered, she said quietly, sitting down beside him. The space between them on the bench felt both too small and too vast. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching fallen leaves dance across the path. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around her cup. I used to practice my lines for hours, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. For the school plays. I'd stand in front of my mirror, trying to get everything perfect, thinking maybe if I was good enough. She paused, swallowing hard. Maybe then you'd come. John's chest tightened. He remembered the crumpled program Sarah had left on the kitchen table, silent accusations of his absence. The worst part wasn't even the empty seat, Emily continued, her voice growing stronger. It was watching other kids run to their dads afterward, getting flowers and hugs. Mom tried so hard to make up for it, but she shook her head. It wasn't the same. John listened, every word hitting him like a physical blow. He watched a jogger pass by, giving himself time to steady his voice. I told myself I was doing important work, he said finally. That keeping other people safe somehow justified not being there for you. I was wrong, Emily, so wrong. Emily took a sip of her hot chocolate, leaving a small smudge of whipped cream on her upper lip, just like when she was little. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar it made John's heart ache. I used to make up stories, she admitted. Tell my friends you were on special assignments like some kind of secret agent. It felt better than saying you just didn't come. I'm sorry, John said, the words feeling inadequate. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry for every moment I missed, every time I let you down. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. I wanted to hate you sometimes, she said, but I mostly just missed you. Even when I was angry, I still wished you were there. As they prepared to leave, Emily stood and hesitated for a moment before stepping forward to give John a brief but genuine hug. The gesture, simple as it was, felt like a gift he wasn't sure he deserved. As they separated, John caught a glimpse of the little girl she'd once been, the one who used to run to him with open arms, before he'd taught her to expect disappointment. The legal aid clinic buzzed with activity as phones rang and voices echoed through the narrow hallways. Isaiah's office, tucked away in the corner of the building, was cramped but organized despite the towering stacks of case files covering every surface. The walls were decorated with his law degree and various awards for public service, but Isaiah barely noticed them anymore as he hunched over his desk, massaging his temples. The harsh fluorescent lights made his growing headache worse as he squinted at yet another case file. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten among the paperwork. A young intern knocked on his door, adding 3 more files to his already overwhelming workload. John's arrival was unexpected. He stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with concern etched on his weathered face. "You look like you haven't slept in days," he said quietly. Isaiah forced a smile, straightening up in his chair. "Just busy. Lots of cases need attention." His voice was hoarse from hours of phone calls and courthouse appearances. "When was the last time you took a break?" John asked, moving a stack of papers to sit in the visitor's chair. "I'm fine," Isaiah insisted, but his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "These kids need help. I can't let them down." John leaned forward, his expression serious. "You're not letting anyone down by taking care of yourself." The words seemed to crack something in Isaiah's carefully maintained facade. His shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand over his face. "There are so many of them, John. Every day more teenagers come through that door. Foster kids, runaways, kids in trouble. They all need someone in their corner. And you're trying to be that someone for all of them," John observed softly. "I have to be." Isaiah's voice cracked. "I made it out. I got lucky. How can I not help them?" John nodded slowly, understanding the weight of survivors' guilt all too well. "I spent years carrying everyone else's burdens, thinking it was my duty. All it did was wear me down until I couldn't help anyone, not even my own family." Isaiah's eyes flickered to the photo of his wife and daughter on his desk. I see myself in every one of these kids. When they look at me with hope in their eyes, I can't bear the thought of failing them." "You're not failing them by setting boundaries," John said firmly. "These kids need you at your best, not burned out and exhausted." Isaiah stared at the files covering his desk, his shoulders tense. "Maybe you're right," he admitted reluctantly. "I'll try to delegate more cases to the other attorneys." John could see the internal struggle playing across Isaiah's face, the battle between his desire to help everyone and the recognition that he was stretching himself too thin. It was a familiar battle, one John had fought many times himself. "I'll think about what you said," Isaiah promised, though his expression remained uncertain. The aroma of Camille's home-cooked pot roast filled the warm kitchen as the family gathered around the dining table. Lily bounced excitedly in her chair, her science project folder propped against the water glass as she explained the intricacies of her volcano experiment to anyone who would listen. "And then the baking soda goes whoosh," she demonstrated with animated hands, nearly knocking over her glass before Camille caught it with practiced ease. "Careful, sweetheart," Camille smiled, serving generous portions onto everyone's plates. The steam rose from the perfectly cooked vegetables and tender meat, and John couldn't remember the last time he'd sat down to such a proper family dinner. As they settled into eating, the conversation flowed naturally, the clinking of silverware mixed with comfortable chatter, creating a symphony of domestic contentment that made John's chest tighten with both joy and regret. "This is wonderful," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Isaiah caught the note in his voice. "Something on your mind, John?" John set his fork down, taking a deep breath. "It's just seeing all this, being here with your family. It reminds me of everything I lost." His voice grew thick with emotion. "I was so caught up in the job thinking I had to save everyone that I forgot to save what mattered most." Camille reached across the table, touching his hand gently. "It's never too late to make things right." "I keep wondering if any of it was worth it," John continued, staring at his plate. "All those years of putting the job first, missing Emily's recitals, Sarah's birthdays. I told myself I was making a difference, but most days it felt like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon." "But you did make a difference," Isaiah said firmly. "Look at us sitting here. Without you, none of this would exist. You didn't just save my life that night. You gave me hope when I had nothing else." Lily looked up from her plate, curious. "Is that why Daddy keeps your police badge number in his office?" Isaiah smiled softly. "That's right, sweetheart. That number reminded me that there were good people in the world when I needed to remember that most." "John," Camille added, her voice gentle but firm, "sometimes we can't see the ripples we create in others' lives, But look around this table. My husband is alive because of you. Our daughter exists because of you. The hundreds of kids Isaiah helps at the legal clinic, that's your legacy too." John blinked rapidly, fighting back tears as he looked at their earnest faces. The weight of years of self-doubt began to lift slightly from his shoulders. After dinner, they moved to the living room where a fire crackled softly in the fireplace. Lily climbed onto the couch next to John, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. "Mr. John?" she asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Did you ever save any other kids when you were a police officer?" For the first time that evening, John felt a genuine smile spread across his face. "Well," he began, settling back into the cushions. "There was this one time during a winter storm." The crisp morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of John's modest apartment, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. The unexpected sound of the doorbell made his heart skip a beat. When he opened the door, Emily stood there, clutching a thick, leather-bound scrapbook to her chest. Her smile, though small and hesitant, held more warmth than he'd seen in years. "I thought maybe we could look through this together," she said softly, holding up the book. "If you want to, that is." John stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. His hands trembled slightly as he cleared some newspapers from the coffee table. "Would you like some coffee, or tea maybe?" "Tea would be nice," Emily replied, settling onto the worn couch. She ran her hand over the scrapbook's cover, tracing the embossed patterns with her fingers. While John busied himself in the kitchen, Emily began laying out the book. The kettle's whistle broke the silence, and soon John returned with 2 steaming mugs. He sat down beside her, leaving enough space to be respectful but close enough to see the photos. "Mom helped me put this together," Emily explained, opening to the first page. "It started as a school project, but I kept adding to it over the years." The first photo showed Emily at her kindergarten graduation, wearing a tiny cap and gown. Her smile revealed missing front teeth, and her pigtails stuck out at odd angles. John's throat tightened. He'd missed that day because of a double shift. "You were always so particular about those pigtails," he said softly. "Remember how you'd cry if they weren't exactly even?" Emily laughed, a genuine sound that filled the room. "Mom used to measure them with a ruler because I was so picky." They turned the pages slowly, each photograph sparking a conversation. There were birthday parties, school plays, and family vacations, some with John, many without. But instead of wielding these memories as weapons, Emily shared them like pieces of a puzzle she wanted him to understand. "This was my first ballet recital," she said, pointing to a photo of herself in a pink tutu. "I was terrified of going on stage." John nodded, remembering the phone call he'd received about her stage fright. "I told you to pretend the audience was just a bunch of teddy bears in chairs. You remember that?" Emily looked surprised. "It actually helped. I imagined all these stuffed animals sitting there, and suddenly it wasn't so scary anymore." As they continued through the book, their conversation flowed more naturally. John found himself sharing stories about cases he'd worked, explaining why he'd missed certain events, but also revealing how often his thoughts had been with her. Emily listened intently, her expression softening as she began to understand the complexity of his struggles. "I know you cared, Dad," she said finally, touching a photo of them at the beach when she was 6. "I was angry for a long time because I thought you chose your job over us. But looking at these pictures with you now, I can see that you were trying to protect everyone, including us. You just got lost somewhere along the way." Tears welled in John's eyes as he nodded, unable to speak. Emily reached over and squeezed his hand, the gesture full of forgiveness and hope. Sunlight streamed through the large bay windows of Isaiah's living room, casting a warm glow over the scattered art supplies covering the coffee table. John sat cross-legged on the plush carpet beside Lily, watching as she meticulously colored with her favorite crayons. The peaceful afternoon was filled with the soft scratching of wax on paper and occasional giggles from the 8-year-old. "Uncle John," Lily said, using the nickname she'd given him recently. "Can you pass me the blue crayon? I need it for the police uniform." John handed her the crayon, curious about her project. "What are you drawing there, sweetheart?" Lily worked with intense concentration, her tongue poking out slightly. "It's a surprise. You have to wait until it's finished." For the next 20 minutes, John helped her sort through crayons and offered encouragement as she worked. The simple act of sitting there, helping with an art project, filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Finally, Lily held up her drawing with pride. "Look, it's you saving my daddy." John's breath caught in his throat as he looked at the picture. There, in bright crayon colors, was a police officer with a badge, drawn much larger than real life, standing protectively over a small boy. The officer wore a cape like a superhero and had a big smile on his face. "Daddy told me all about how you saved him," Lily explained, pointing to different parts of her drawing. "See? That's your police car, and there's your special badge number that you gave him. He said you were his hero." John's vision blurred with unexpected tears. He blinked them back quickly, but his voice was rough when he spoke. I never thought of myself as a hero, Lily. I was just doing my job." "But you are a hero," Lily insisted, her brown eyes serious. "Daddy says he wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. And then I wouldn't be here either." The sound of footsteps made John look up. Isaiah and Camille stood in the doorway, watching the scene with soft smiles. "She's right, you know," Isaiah said quietly, moving into the room. "That night changed everything for me. Your kindness gave me hope when I needed it most." Camille nodded, sitting down beside them. "Isaiah still has your badge number memorized. He made sure Lily knew it too, just in case she ever needed help." John looked down at the drawing again, seeing himself through their eyes for the first time. The hero in Lily's picture wasn't the broken man he'd seen in the mirror all these years. This was someone who made a difference, who gave hope to a scared little boy. "Can I keep this?" he asked Lily softly. "I made it for you," she beamed, carefully handing him the paper. With gentle movements, John folded the drawing and took out his wallet. He placed it inside, next to the few precious photos he carried. It would stay there, a reminder that maybe he had done some good after all. The desk lamp cast a harsh glow over Isaiah's troubled face as he hunched over his laptop, surrounded by towering stacks of case files. The clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m., but he showed no signs of stopping. His fingers drummed restlessly on the desk while his other hand rubbed his temples. John appeared in the doorway holding 2 steaming cups of tea. He noticed the tension in Isaiah's shoulders, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched as he stared at the screen. "Thought you might need this," John said quietly, setting 1 cup beside Isaiah's laptop. Isaiah barely glanced up. "Thanks, but I'm fine. Just need to finish these cases." "You don't look fine," John pressed gently, settling into a chair across from the desk. "You've been working late every night this week." "I said I'm fine," Isaiah snapped, then immediately looked apologetic. I need to keep working. These kids need help." John stayed silent, waiting. The tension in the room grew thick until Isaiah suddenly slammed his laptop shut. "How do I deserve any of this?" he burst out, gesturing around his office. "The career, the family, this life. My mom, she never got to see any of it. She died protecting me. And what have I done to earn that sacrifice?" His voice cracked on the last word. John's heart ached as he watched the successful lawyer before him transform back into that scared 11-year-old boy. "Every case I win, every kid I help," Isaiah continued, his words tumbling out. "It's never enough. I keep thinking if I just work harder, help more people, maybe then I'll deserve to be alive when she's not. But it never feels like enough." John set his tea down carefully. "I understand more than you know," he said softly. "For years, I've wondered if I could have done something different that night. If I'd been faster, smarter, better trained, maybe Linda would still be alive." Isaiah looked up, surprised by the admission. "But I've learned something," John continued. "Carrying that guilt doesn't honor your mother's memory. It doesn't make her sacrifice more meaningful. It just prevents you from fully living the life she died to protect." Tears welled in Isaiah's eyes. "How do you let it go?" "By accepting that you don't have to earn the right to live," John replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "Your mother loved you. She wanted you to thrive. not spend your life trying to prove you deserve to survive. Isaiah's shoulders began to shake as years of pent-up grief and guilt finally broke free. "I miss her so much," he whispered. "I know," John said, moving around the desk to place a steadying hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "And that's okay. But she'd want you to forgive yourself." They sat in understanding silence, two men bound by a shared tragedy, finally acknowledging the weight they'd both carried for too long. "Thank you," Isaiah said finally, wiping his eyes. "For everything. For being here, even when I didn't know I needed you." Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm patches across the breakfast table where Isaiah sat with his family. Lily was spreading jam on her toast while Camille sipped her coffee, both enjoying the peaceful morning routine. The aroma of fresh coffee and buttered toast filled the air as John entered, looking more relaxed than he had in weeks. "Good morning," Camille greeted warmly, gesturing to an empty chair. "There's fresh coffee if you'd like some." John poured himself a cup and settled into the chair, noticing how natural it felt to be part of their morning ritual. Isaiah cleared his throat, setting down his newspaper. "John, I wanted to ask you something," Isaiah began, his tone serious but gentle. "There's this boy at the community center, Marcus. He's 12, and his situation—" Isaiah paused, choosing his words carefully. "Well, he reminds me a lot of myself at that age." John's hand tightened slightly around his coffee cup. "How so?" "He's lost his father and his mother's working 2 jobs just to keep them afloat. He's smart, but he's angry, feeling lost." Isaiah leaned forward. "I think he could really benefit from having someone like you in his corner." John shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't know, Isaiah. My track record with mentoring isn't exactly stellar." Camille spoke up, her voice kind but firm. "That's not true, John. Look at how you helped Isaiah. Sometimes one person showing they care can change everything." "But I failed my own family," John protested weakly. "And you're working to make that right," Isaiah countered. "That's exactly what makes you perfect for this. You understand both sides, the importance of being there and the cost of not being there." Later that day, John found himself at the community center, a modest building with motivational posters covering its walls. Marcus sat across from him at a small table, his dark eyes wary but curious. He was small for 12, wearing a too large sweater and scuffed sneakers. "So you're a retired cop?" Marcus asked, trying to sound tough but unable to hide his interest. "That's right," John replied, recognizing the same mix of fear and defiance he'd seen in Isaiah's eyes all those years ago. "Isaiah tells me you're interested in law." Marcus shrugged, but his eyes lit up slightly. "Maybe. My mom says it's a good career, but—" He trailed off, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "But what? Kids like me don't become lawyers," Marcus mumbled. John leaned forward. "You know, Isaiah once thought the same thing. Want to know what changed his mind?" Marcus looked up, truly engaged for the first time. "What?" "Someone believed in him, and he worked hard to prove that belief right." They spent the next hour talking, the conversation flowing more easily than John had expected. Marcus gradually opened up about his struggles at school, his worry about his mom working so hard, and his dreams of making things better for his family. As John prepared to leave the community center, he watched Marcus head to the study area with a new spring in his step. For the first time in years, John felt the familiar warmth of knowing he'd made a real difference in someone's day. Sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds of John's small apartment kitchen, casting thin strips of light across the empty table where he sat. The blank piece of paper before him seemed to mock his hesitation, its pristine surface waiting for words he'd held back for far too long. His weathered hands gripped a blue ballpoint pen, and he noticed they were trembling slightly. The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background as John took a deep breath, steadying himself. Coffee grew cold in his favorite mug, forgotten as he focused on the task ahead. He'd written countless police reports over his career, but this letter to Emily felt more daunting than any of them. "Dear Emily," he wrote, then paused, studying his handwriting. The words that followed came slowly at first, each one carefully chosen. "I've started this letter 100 times in my head. but putting it on paper makes it real. There's so much I need to say to you. So many years I need to account for. The truth is, I failed you as a father. Not because I didn't love you. I've loved you every single day of your life. But because I didn't show it the way you deserved. John stopped, wiping moisture from his eyes before continuing. I remember your 5th birthday party. How excited you were about the butterfly cake your mom made. I was called into work and left early. I told myself it was necessary, that providing for you was more important than being there. I was wrong, Emily. So wrong. His pen moved more freely now as memories flowed onto the page. I think about your school plays, your soccer games, all the moments I missed because I thought my job had to come first. Meeting Isaiah again, seeing the impact one person can have on another's life, has shown me how backwards my priorities were. I was so focused on helping strangers that I forgot my most important responsibility, being your dad. The morning light grew stronger as John continued writing, pouring out years of regret and love onto the paper. You were such a bright, creative little girl. I still have the macaroni art you made in 1st grade. It's in my wallet, though the pasta fell off years ago. I kept it because even when I was at my worst, I never stopped loving you. Finally, after several rewrites and crossed-out sentences, John reached the end. I know I can't make up for lost time, but if you'll let me, I'd like to try building something new. I'm learning that it's never too late to try making things right. Love, Dad. John read the letter several times, making small adjustments until the words felt as honest as he could make them. His hands were steady now as he carefully folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope. He wrote Emily's address in clear, deliberate strokes. The walk to the mailbox felt longer than usual. John stood there for a moment, the letter in his hand, taking one last look at the envelope that held so many hopes and regrets. With a deep breath, he pulled open the mailbox door and let the letter drop in. The metallic clang as it hit the bottom seemed to echo his racing heart. John lingered by the mailbox, staring at the closed door as if expecting an immediate response. Finally, he turned and began the walk back to his apartment, feeling both lighter and more vulnerable than he had in years. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Isaiah's cramped office, casting harsh shadows across mountains of case files that threatened to topple from his desk. Isaiah slouched in his chair, his usually crisp suit wrinkled and his tie hung loose around his neck. His fingers pressed against his temples, trying to ward off a growing headache as he stared at the file before him. The case detailed a 16-year-old boy living on the streets, kicked out by parents who couldn't accept him. The familiar ache in Isaiah's chest grew stronger with each word he read. The boy's story hit too close to home, stirring memories of his own uncertain days in foster care after his mother's death. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. John stood in the doorway, concern etched on his weathered face. "You look like you haven't slept in days," he said, stepping into the cluttered office. Isaiah barely glanced up. "I'm fine," he muttered, shuffling papers around his desk. "Just busy." "Isaiah," John's voice carried the same firm kindness he'd used years ago. "You're not fine. Talk to me." The papers in Isaiah's hands trembled slightly. "I can't take a break, John. There's too much at stake." He gestured to the file in front of him. "This kid, Marcus, he's living under a bridge because his parents threw him away like garbage, just like..." His voice caught. "Just like you could have ended up," John finished softly. "I have to help him," Isaiah's voice cracked. "I have to help all of them. But for every case I close, 3 more appear. It never ends." His fist clenched, crumpling the corner of a document. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm making any difference at all." John pulled up a chair, sitting across from Isaiah. "You're not superhuman. You can't save everyone." "I should be able to do more," Isaiah snapped, pushing back from his desk. "These kids need someone in their corner. They need you at your best," John interrupted firmly. "Not burned out and running on empty." Isaiah's shoulders sagged. I remember how it felt, thinking no one cared, that nobody would help." He picked up Marcus's file again, his hands shaking slightly. Every time I read something like this, I'm right back there, watching Mom. He couldn't finish the sentence. John reached across the desk, gently taking the file from Isaiah's hands. Let me help. You don't have to carry this alone. Isaiah stared at his empty hands for a long moment before nodding slowly. Maybe you're right. He looked around his chaotic office as if seeing it clearly for the first time. I haven't been home for dinner in weeks. Lily asked me yesterday why I don't read her bedtime stories anymore. Start there, John suggested. Go home tonight. Be with your family. The work will still be here tomorrow and I'll help you tackle it. Rain drummed steadily against John's apartment windows, creating a soothing rhythm that matched his contemplative mood. He sat in his worn armchair by the window, watching droplets trace paths down the glass while the gray morning light filtered through the clouds. The street below was quiet, with only occasional cars splashing through puddles that had formed in the uneven pavement. His thoughts drifted to the letter he'd sent Emily, wondering if he'd said enough or too much. Each passing day since mailing it had felt longer than the last. The soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallway pulled him from his thoughts, followed by a gentle knock at his door. John's heart skipped a beat as he opened the door to find a delivery driver holding out an envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he signed for it, recognizing Emily's neat handwriting on the front. The driver disappeared down the hallway as John stood frozen in his doorway, staring at the envelope as if it might vanish. Finally, he moved to his small kitchen table, pulling out a chair and sitting down heavily. The envelope felt impossibly light in his hands, yet weighted with significance. Taking a deep breath, he carefully opened it, trying to steady his shaking fingers. "Dear Dad," the letter began, and John had to pause, overwhelmed by those two simple words. He hadn't seen them written in Emily's hand for so many years. As he read on, emotions washed over him in waves. Emily's words were measured but genuine, acknowledging the effort he'd made to reach out. She wrote about how his letter had touched her, how she'd read it multiple times sitting in her favorite reading spot by her own window. She admitted to crying while reading certain parts, particularly when he'd recalled specific memories from her childhood. However, Emily remained cautious. "Words are important," she wrote, "but actions speak louder. I need to see consistency, Dad. I need to know you won't disappear again when things get difficult." Her honesty struck him like a physical blow, but he recognized the truth in her words. The letter continued, proposing a meeting with both her and Sarah present. "Mom and I have talked," she explained. "We think it's important that we all sit down together and discuss how to move forward as a family. We can't pretend the past didn't happen, but maybe we can build something new." John had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by gratitude for this chance. His vision blurred with unshed tears as he finished the letter, taking in every word carefully. Emily had signed it, "Love," followed by her name, a small gesture that meant everything. With reverent care, he folded the letter along its original creases. Opening his wallet, he placed it beside Lily's crayon drawing, two precious symbols of hope for his future. The rain continued its steady pattern against the windows, but now it felt less melancholic and more like a cleansing shower, washing away old pain and making room for new growth. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cafe windows, creating a warm glow that contrasted with the nervous tension in John's chest. He paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath before pushing open the heavy glass door. The familiar scent of coffee and freshly baked pastries filled the air, as his eyes adjusted to the interior lighting. Sarah and Emily were already seated at a corner table, their heads bent close together in quiet conversation. Emily noticed him first, straightening up and offering a small wave. Sarah's posture stiffened slightly, but she managed a polite nod as John approached. "Hi," John said softly, pulling out the wooden chair across from them. His hands fidgeted with the paper napkin on the table. "You look well," Sarah commented after an awkward pause, her tone carefully neutral. Emily stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking gently against the ceramic mug. "How have you been since retirement?" Emily asked, breaking the tension. Her voice carried genuine curiosity. John took a sip of water, gathering his thoughts. "Honestly, It's been different, quieter than I expected. He paused, then continued with careful honesty. It's given me time to think about everything, about all my mistakes. He told them about Isaiah, how their reconnection had opened his eyes to the impact of both presence and absence in someone's life. His voice grew thick with emotion as he described the parallel between Isaiah's situation and his own family's. I understand now what I took for granted, he said, looking directly at Emily. What I missed while I was so focused on helping everyone else. Emily's eyes glistened. Dad, I was so angry for so long, she admitted, her voice wavering. There were so many empty seats at my performances. So many times I looked for you in the audience. Sarah reached over and squeezed Emily's hand. We both were, she added quietly. But we can see you're trying now. John nodded, swallowing hard. I know I can't make up for lost time, but I want to do better, if you'll let me. Emily wiped her eyes with her napkin. I think I'd like that. But we need help doing this right. She straightened her shoulders. I've been thinking about family therapy, all three of us. Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly, but she nodded slowly. That might be good. Professional help could give us structure for this. I'll do whatever it takes, John agreed immediately. Whatever you both need to feel comfortable with this process. They spent the next hour setting boundaries and expectations, their coffee growing cold as they talked. The conversation flowed more easily as time passed, though certain topics still carried an edge of pain. As they prepared to leave, Emily surprised John by linking her arm through his as they walked toward the exit. The simple gesture of trust made his throat tight with emotion. Sarah walked beside them, her expression thoughtful as they stepped out into the fading sunlight. The evening settled softly around Isaiah's backyard, where wind chimes tinkled gently in the cool breeze. John sat in a weathered Adirondack chair, watching steam rise from his tea as crickets began their nightly chorus. Isaiah sat nearby, absently checking his phone for work emails. Through the kitchen window, Camille moved efficiently between counter and stove, the warm light inside creating a cozy tableau. But her worried glances toward Isaiah didn't escape John's notice. When Isaiah stepped inside to take a work call, Camille slipped out to the backyard. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself as she approached John. I'm worried about him, she said quietly, sinking into the chair Isaiah had vacated. He barely sleeps anymore. When I try to talk to him about it, he just says he's fine and changes the subject. John nodded, recognizing the pattern. How long has this been going on? Weeks now. Camille's voice cracked slightly. He won't even talk to me anymore. It's like he's building walls, trying to handle everything alone. After dinner, John suggested a drive to Isaiah, who agreed after some gentle persistence. They cruised through the city's quiet streets, streetlights casting intermittent shadows across the dashboard. John steered them toward the old neighborhood park where Isaiah used to play as a child. The playground equipment stood silent in the darkness, a ghost of happier times. They settled onto a wooden bench, the same one where Isaiah's mother used to watch him play. This place hasn't changed much, John observed softly. Isaiah stared at his hands. Sometimes I feel like I haven't either, he admitted. Like I'm still that scared kid, just pretending to be someone else. The words seemed to break a dam. Isaiah's voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. Everyone looks at me like I'm some kind of success story, the orphan who made good. But inside, he shook his head. Inside, I'm terrified of letting everyone down, of proving I didn't deserve to survive that night. John listened quietly as Isaiah poured out his fears, about work, about being a husband and father, about living up to the expectations people had placed on him. I feel like a fraud, Isaiah whispered, like I'm wearing a mask, and someday everyone will see through it. John turned to face him. You know what I see? I see someone who's human, someone who's allowed to struggle, to have doubts. That doesn't make you a fraud, it makes you real. He shared his own battles with feeling unworthy, how he'd let those feelings destroy his family. Perfect people don't exist, Isaiah, and pretending to be perfect only pushes away the people who love you. Isaiah wiped his eyes. Camille's been trying so hard to reach me. I don't want her to think less of me. She won't, John assured him. She'll think more of you for trusting her with the truth. The drive home was quiet but lighter somehow. As they pulled into the driveway, Isaiah turned to John. "Thank you," he said softly. "For listening, for understanding. I'll try to be more open with Camille." John watched pride bloom in his chest as Isaiah walked toward his front door, shoulders straighter than they'd been in weeks. The afternoon sun filtered through gauzy curtains in Dr. Rachel Bennett's office, casting soft shadows across the pale blue walls. John arrived 15 minutes early, his hands slightly trembling as he sat in his car, gathering courage. He watched Sarah and Emily pull into the parking lot, their figures moving with hesitation toward the building's entrance. Inside the therapist's office, the furniture was arranged thoughtfully, 3 comfortable armchairs forming a loose circle with Dr. Bennett's seat. The air carried a faint lavender scent from a diffuser humming quietly in the corner. Family photos lined the walls, their happy faces seeming to mock John's anxiety. Sarah chose the chair furthest from John, while Emily settled between them. The silence felt heavy, until Dr. Bennett, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, began the session. "I'd like each of you to share why you're here today," she said gently, "and what you hope to achieve through these sessions. John, would you like to start?" John's throat tightened, but he forced himself to meet his family's eyes. "I'm here because I failed as a husband and father," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I convinced myself that being a good police officer meant sacrificing everything else. I was wrong." He paused, swallowing hard. "I let work consume me until I lost sight of what really mattered. I missed birthdays, school plays, parent-teacher conferences, moments I can never get back." Sarah's fingers twisted in her lap as she listened. When it was her turn, her voice carried years of buried pain. "I had to be both mother and father," she said. "I watched Emily wait by the window on nights you promised to come home early. I made excuses for you until I couldn't anymore. The hardest part wasn't raising her alone. It was watching her heart break over and over." Emily wiped tears from her cheeks as her mother spoke. When Dr. Bennett turned to her, she seemed to shrink in her chair. "I used to tell my friends you were saving the world," she said quietly. "But as I got older, I realized you just didn't want to be home with us. I started thinking maybe there was something wrong with me, something that made you stay away." Dr. Bennett guided their conversation skillfully, helping them navigate through painful memories while keeping the focus on healing. They discussed concrete steps for rebuilding trust, regular family dinners, scheduled one-on-one time, and continued therapy sessions. "Remember," Dr. Bennett said, "healing isn't linear. There will be difficult moments, but acknowledging the pain is the first step toward moving forward." As the session drew to a close, they agreed to meet again the following week. Standing in the parking lot afterward, John felt both drained and lighter somehow, as if sharing the burden of their past had created space for something new to grow. The afternoon sun filtered through gauzy curtains in Dr. Rachel Bennett's office, casting soft shadows across the pale blue walls. John arrived 15 minutes early, his hands slightly trembling as he sat in his car, gathering courage. He watched Sarah and Emily pull into the parking lot, their figures moving with hesitation toward the building's entrance. Inside the therapist's office, the furniture was arranged thoughtfully, 3 comfortable armchairs forming a loose circle with Dr. Bennett's seat. The air carried a faint lavender scent from a diffuser humming quietly in the corner. Family photos lined the walls, their happy faces seeming to mock John's anxiety. Sarah chose the chair furthest from John, while Emily settled between them. The silence felt heavy until Dr. Bennett, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, began the session. "I'd like each of you to share why you're here today," she said gently, "and what you hope to achieve through these sessions. John, would you like to start?" John's throat tightened, but he forced himself to meet his family's eyes. "I'm here because I failed as a husband and father," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I convinced myself that being a good police officer meant sacrificing everything else. I was wrong." He paused, swallowing hard. "I let work consume me, and I missed so many important moments. I want to make amends, if you'll let me." Sarah shifted in her chair, her fingers twisting the tissue in her hands. "For years, I carried everything alone," she said, her voice trembling. "Parent-teacher conferences, doctor appointments, middle-of-the-night fevers. I handled it all while you were saving everyone else." She wiped at her eyes. The hardest part wasn't even the practical stuff. It was watching Emily's face fall every time you missed another recital or birthday. Emily sat quietly, shoulders hunched as she listened to her parents. When Dr. Bennett gently prompted her to share, she spoke barely above a whisper. "I used to make up stories about why you weren't there," she admitted, not looking at John. "I told my friends you were working on really important cases, saving people, but eventually, I stopped believing that myself." Her voice cracked. "I started thinking maybe I just wasn't important enough." Dr. Bennett guided them through the painful confessions with careful questions and observations. She helped them establish ground rules for communication and suggested weekly meetings to continue their progress. As they talked, the tension in the room gradually eased, replaced by a cautious openness. When the session drew to a close, they had agreed on concrete steps: regular family dinners, one-on-one time between John and Emily, and continued therapy sessions. As they gathered their belongings, Emily briefly touched John's arm, a small gesture that made his heart leap with hope. Sarah's expression, though still guarded, had softened slightly. They walked to their cars together, the late afternoon sun warming their faces. John felt lighter somehow, as if sharing their pain had already begun to heal something long broken between them. The aroma of roasting turkey and fresh-baked pies wafted through Isaiah's home, mingling with the sound of football commentary from the living room television. Sunlight streamed through the bay windows, catching the fall decorations Camille had carefully arranged. Orange and red leaves scattered artfully across the dining table, small pumpkins nestled between flickering candles. John stood in the doorway, a bottle of wine clutched tightly in his hands, watching Sarah and Emily climb the front steps behind him. His daughter caught his eye and gave him a small, encouraging smile. The past few months of therapy had slowly begun to bridge the chasm between them, though the journey was far from over. Inside, the house hummed with activity. Camille moved efficiently between kitchen and dining room, directing traffic with the expertise of a seasoned hostess. Lily darted between adults' legs, her excitement palpable as she showed off her turkey-themed dress to anyone who would look. "John!" Isaiah emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron that read, "Kiss the Cook." He embraced John warmly, then welcomed Sarah and Emily with equal enthusiasm. "We're so glad you could all make it." The afternoon unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Emily gravitated toward John during the pre-dinner mingling, sharing stories about her work and asking questions about his early days on the force. Sarah watched their interaction from across the room, her expression softening when she thought no one was looking. When they gathered around the table, the spread was impressive. Golden turkey, stuffing studded with cranberries, creamy mashed potatoes, and all the traditional fixings. Isaiah stood, raising his glass as conversation quieted. "Before we eat, I'd like to say something," he began, his voice thick with emotion. 22 years ago, a police officer saved my life. But he did more than that. He gave me hope when I had none." Isaiah's eyes met John's. "That officer is here today, and I want to thank him not just for that night, but for being part of our family now." Camille squeezed Isaiah's hand before adding her own words. "John, you might not realize it, but your kindness that night created ripples that touched all our lives. We're blessed to have you here." Lily bounced in her seat, her hand shooting up. "Can I say something too?" At her mother's nod, she stood on her chair. "Thank you, hero grandpa." Her innocent declaration brought tears to several eyes around the table. The surprise came from Sarah, who cleared her throat softly. "You've come a long way, John," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet table. The simple acknowledgement hit John like a physical force, warming him more than any embrace could have. The meal progressed with comfortable conversation and occasional laughter. John found himself sharing stories about his academy days, while Emily chimed in with questions about what he was like as a young officer. Sarah even contributed a few memories from their early marriage, her voice holding more fondness than bitterness for the first time in years. As plates were cleared and dessert was served, John watched his daughter teaching Lily how to play checkers by the fireplace. The warmth of the fire matched the warmth in his chest, a feeling of belonging he hadn't experienced in far too long. The crisp November air carried the lingering scent of fallen leaves as John stepped onto Isaiah's wraparound porch. Above him, stars dotted the clear night sky like scattered diamonds. He leaned against the wooden railing, his breath visible in small puffs, while the muffled sounds of dishes being cleared drifted through the windows behind him. The screen door creaked softly. Emily appeared beside him, 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea warming her hands. "Thought you might like something hot," she said, offering one to him. Their fingers brushed as he took the mug, a small moment of connection that would have felt impossible just months ago. They stood in comfortable silence, sipping their tea and watching their breath mingle with the steam rising from their mugs. The quiet felt different now, peaceful rather than strained. "Dad," Emily began, her voice soft but steady. "I wanted to thank you. For everything you've been doing, I mean. The therapy sessions, the letters, showing up consistently." She paused, wrapping both hands around her mug. "I know it hasn't been easy." John's throat tightened. "Emily, Let me finish," she said gently. "Things aren't perfect between us, and maybe they never will be exactly like they were. But..." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the porch light. "I'm hopeful. For the first time in years, I actually believe we can build something new." John nodded, taking a moment to steady his voice. "Meeting Isaiah again, reconnecting with you. It's changed everything for me. I spent so many years feeling lost, thinking I'd ruined any chance at having a real family." He gestured toward the warm light spilling from the windows. "Now I feel like I've finally found my place." From inside, Lily's delighted giggle rang out, followed by Isaiah's deeper chuckle and Camille's warm laughter. The sound of cabinets opening and closing suggested they were gathering plates for dessert. "I never thought I'd have this," John admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "A second chance with you, a relationship with Isaiah's family. It feels like more than I deserve." Emily touched his arm lightly. "Maybe it's exactly what you deserve, Dad. What we all deserve." The screen door opened again and Lily's excited voice called out, "Emily, Grandpa John, Mom made her special apple pie." John smiled at the title. Grandpa John still felt new and precious every time he heard it. Emily squeezed his arm once before heading inside. John took a final look at the starlit sky, feeling a deep sense of gratitude settle in his chest. Then he turned and followed his daughter back into the warmth of the house, where Isaiah, Camille, and Lily were gathered around the table, saving spots for them both. If you enjoyed the story of John, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.